Hello and welcome to this video on the subject of image presentation. My name's Barry Beckham. The matte effect has always been one of my favourites. We can use this for print purposes, printing an image with the border attached, the one we create in Photoshop. But it's also a nice technique for on-screen viewing of our images, and it's particularly good for those who create audiovisual presentations in software like PTE AV Studio. On this occasion, I'm working in Photoshop here with a high resolution image from a 20 megapixel camera. But this technique works equally well on any resolution we choose. Let's take a look. We need to start the process in the Layers palette on the right hand side. I need to click the lock here just to remove it. Now I need to go to the top left of my screen to my image menu. And from there I need canvas size. We can use the canvas size window in a couple of ways. If I remove the tick from the relative box, we get the overall size of this image. 20 inches by 13.333. So if I wanted to add 4 inches to the width of this, I would have to increase that value to 24, and this would become 17.333. And we get various ways to measure. But what I'm going to do for speed here is to tick that relative box, because now we can say to the software, give us 4 inches on the width and 4 inches on the height. And because the anchor point here is in the middle, because it can be moved to any location, then we're going to get 2 inches at the top and bottom, 2 inches left and right, and there we can see it. The next stage is to select that canvas shape. We need to go over to the left hand side to the toolbox and select the magic wand tool. It's grouped with a couple of others, but there's the one we want. And when we click, Photoshop selects that area pretty quickly and easily. We're going to need a new layer, and you'll see why in a few moments. So let's go down to the bottom right, click to create it. And what we're going to do straight away is to flood this with black. This black colour is going to form the shadow that creates the matte effect. Now I'm going to use keystrokes for what I need to do next because it's the easiest way of working. If you look over to the extreme left at the toolbox, you'll notice that we've got a pale grey as the foreground colour and white as the background colour. Anytime you need to return those to black and white, which is what we need now, just touch the D key. And there you can see I now have black as my foreground colour. Just as a small aside here, if you touch the X key, you can see those colours are toggled background to foreground. But with black as my foreground colour, we can always flood the foreground colour with a keystroke of Alt backspace. If I wanted to flood it with white, which is my background colour, I would use Control backspace. Now you'll notice that the selection is still in place. That's good because we need to create another layer which is going to allow us to create the top part of the matte effect. Now in actual fact there's a keystroke to create a new blank layer. So if you don't want to go down to the bottom right corner of your layers to click and select, we can hit Ctrl-Shift-N. That brings up the new layer dialog, and then the Enter key does the rest. So what I'm going to do just to start the process here is I'm going to flood the top layer here in white. White is my background, so Control backspace will flood that. I don't need that selection anymore, so I can remove it either by going to Select, Deselect from the top menus or Control D. The next thing we need to do is to select the layer in the middle, the black one, because we're going to add a degree of blur, and the blur will spill out underneath the white layer above, and that creates the effect. So let's go to our filters menu at the top left of the screen. I'm going to choose blur and Gaussian blur. Now you can see the setting that's appeared on screen. It's somewhere around 43 radius in pixels, and you can see straight away we're getting a really nice matte effect here. Now we do have one or two options here. We can reduce the radius, making the effect very, very delicate or as strong as we want. But I think that figure of around 40 something was working pretty well. Once I apply that, I can adjust the density of the shadow layer from the opacity in the layers here. So I could drop that down to lessen the impact. So we've got quite a degree of control to be able to create almost any drop shadow density we want. There's also another option. If we're working on an image that may be a lot darker than this, then the drop shadow may be difficult to see. In that case, what we can do is we can duplicate that shadow layer, the one in the middle, and the intensity of the drop shadow then increases. So when we create the first drop shadow, if we feel one layer doesn't give us the density in the shadow we want, we can add a second or a third layer. But that doesn't prevent us from tempering the second layer in the same way as I described a few moments ago with the opacity. But with this image, I think the one layer works pretty well, so I'll drop this one in the bin and we'll move on from here. What I'd like to do is to add a degree of colour to the matte frame. So I need to select that from the layers at the top right. And I also would like to sample a colour from within the image, something fairly neutral, something that's going to work well with the image and hopefully be in harmony with it. What I'd like to do first is to lock the layer at the top of the layered stack here. If we look at this layer and briefly turn off the other two, we've got quite a large amount of this which is transparent. I'm going to need to flood this with colour, so to prevent the colour from going into the transparent area, I can click this little lock. The lock will appear to the right of the thumbnail, so now I can flood this shape here with any colour I like and it's not going to spill over and cover up the image. So I'm going to go over to the left hand side to the toolbox to the eyedropper tool, because this is going to allow me to sample a colour from the image. We have all sorts of options at the top of the screen, but point sample is as good as we need here. I'm going to pick up something that's fairly neutral. So I'm going to pick up the lighter blue here and I'm just going to click, and if you look over to the left hand side you can see blue appears as the foreground colour in my colour picker. We can choose anything we like. I could have moved the eyedropper up just a little bit so we move more towards that buff colour, and wherever I click then that's going to be the foreground colour. Now we know that we can flood any layer, especially if the colour is on the foreground, with Alt backspace. So we can do this a number of times. I could try that blue, Alt backspace. I could try a stronger blue, Alt backspace. You can see the flexibility you have. We're moving a little bit out of our comfort zone here because that colour is far too gaudy for presenting this type of image, but we could take a more neutral blue down the bottom, but it's darker. Once again, Alt backspace. You can see we can try things until we find something that works well. To be honest, I don't think that buff colour up there was working too badly, so let me pick up a slightly different shade from the glass and Alt backspace. Now sometimes even when we do this we feel that perhaps the colour we've chosen is just a little too strong. All is not lost. We've got an enormous amount of flexibility here. If we go up to the image menu we can select the hue and saturation. A nice comfortable shortcut for this is Control U. Now what we can do here is we can adjust the hue. So if we wanted to look at colours independent to the image, we could use the hue here and just move it along that level, and if we see something which is much better, then of course we can use it. I'll reset that to 0 because it was my intention here to look more at the saturation. Just take some of the colour off the background. And then once I've got the colour off, do I want it to be lighter or darker? Let's have a look, see what it looks like. Lighter? That doesn't work too bad, but let's go darker. Not so sure. I think something around, we're not far off there. Let's just go up a little bit. I think that works fairly well. It's in harmony with the image itself, but it presents the image quite nicely. We can also add textures to the top border, but I think perhaps we'll rest our case here. And if we were producing a number of images for an audio-visual sequence, maybe 20 or 30, and we wanted them all to have exactly the same framing, this technique will lend itself very well to being recorded via a Photoshop action. Hit a keystroke or two and the border will be applied just as we see it here. Here you can see another example done in exactly the same way. But once you're happy with the border you've created, save the Photoshop file so you can always come back and adjust the border later. But for using this in a slideshow or for print purposes or for any other reasons, then at some stage you're going to need to flatten the image to finish. I'll see you next time.